Welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, August 16th, 2025, and today we are going to be taking a look at a 2028 presidential election prediction between Governor Gretchen Whitmer of the state of Michigan and Vice President J.D. Vance from the state of Ohio. A 2028 matchup, a Midwestern brawl between two prominent figures in two very important states in the Midwest, Michigan and Ohio. Gretchen Whitmer, who has been serving as the governor of the state of Michigan since 2019. J.D. Vance, who was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2022, 2 years later was elected to be vice president of the United States under Donald Trump and his administration. The 2028 election is not right around the corner, but certainly worth discussing, as we start to see a lot of prominent figures who are open to the idea of running in the 2028 election, and it looks like it's going to be a very interesting matchup on both sides of the aisle. And the Democratic primary, which is widely anticipated to be a hyper-competitive primary, is one that is pretty out there and pretty open. The 2028 race is one that Democrats have been looking to with optimism as Donald Trump's approval rating begins to dwindle, and the way in which Americans view not only the President of the United States, but those closest to him as well as an overall negative point is something that gives Democrats hope for the 2028 election in the event that J.D. Vance is the nominee for Republicans in the next presidential cycle. Now, the mainstream headline here from this race is that no matter what, 2028 is not on track to be a massive year, really in either direction for either political party. And that's the big change from what we've seen in elections, even where there is an unpopular incumbent president. Because even I would argue that in the 2024 race, it wasn't a landslide victory. After all, this was a less impressive victory than both of Obama's victories in 2008 and 2012. And while it was certainly, impressive to a degree, especially for Donald Trump, given the circumstances, it was not necessarily a political landslide. And that really much maxes out what I think either political party is able to get on the upper bounds in the 2028 election. But with that being said, I want to actually get right into the prediction here. We're going to be working with a lot of the same states from the 2024 cycle, from the 2020 cycle, and believe it or not, the 2016 cycle. With Gretchen Whitmer at the helm, Democrats are arguably in a great position. Her electoral history speaks for itself. In 2018, she won against Bill Schuette, who had been an elected statewide official in Michigan before and was, at the time, she won by about 10 points in 2018. In 2022, she won against Tudor Dixon by a larger margin than she won by in 2018, and in a state where Donald Trump won this in the last election by about 1.5 points. Looking at the 2028 cycle, Gretchen Whitmer comes into this with the electoral history in a swing state that Donald Trump had won in 2016 and nearly won in 2020 and then won again in 2024. And so thinking about that, thinking about her electability, I think that Gretchen Whitmer has a very unique appeal. Now, I do think a lot of it depends on who she decides to choose for vice president, but I think that ultimately speaking, Whitmer, coming from the Midwest, having an electoral appeal that is very broad and does very much go right to the core of the center and middle of a road of America. I don't know, looking at the primary, what that would look like in terms of how she would pivot or how she would win over traditional Democratic voters, though I do think that she would be very well liked and received amongst the electorate at baseline. In a general election, Whitmer has outperformed Democrats at the top of the ticket every single time, and arguably for good reason. She has made compelling cases to Michigan and likely would to surrounding states in a way that I do think could boost Democrats in the next cycle, especially in some of the states where they seem to have lost some of these more middle-of-the-ground voters. Not to mention that J.D. Vance's numbers have continued to get worse and worse. His most recent approval rating numbers show him in a worse off point than Donald Trump on the national stage. And that's actually a really difficult thing to do, underperform Donald Trump in terms of overall net approval, because voters never really liked the president of the United States. They never really liked Donald Trump to really any degree, and the 2024 cycle going into 2025 was the first time we had seen in a long time that Trump's numbers had improved. But on the general front, even today, the fact that J.D. Vance underperforms Donald Trump is a really telling sign about the style of candidate that he would be on the national stage. Now, even if J.D. Vance is unpopular, he still wins a lot of the same states that we can expect to be more competitive. Not more competitive, more solid for the GOP. He's going to win Nebraska at large. He's going to win that the 3rd district in the state of Nebraska. He'll win the first one too. And he'll do well, right? He will do nearly the same margin that we have seen for Donald Trump in some of these states, and that really shouldn't surprise too many people. When you're thinking about that, right? Thinking about J.D. Vance won in Ohio by about 6, didn't really underperform Donald Trump to the degree that it would mean that a state like South Carolina would narrow up, or a state like Montana would narrow up. But coming off the last presidential, I do think Democrats look at states maybe like Kansas that with the right shift could narrow down to being a likely state. And I don't disagree. I think that J.D. Vance comes into this with a pretty strong footing in terms of some of the states that he'd win. I think that he'd win Iowa. I think that he'd win Ohio. I think these states would narrow down, though, but coming off, again, the last presidential cycle, it's quite difficult to see that. Iowa, Donald Trump won by 13. I think Whitmer could get it down below 10. Ohio, same thing. But J.D. Vance is going to win his home state, and he's certainly going to win the state of Iowa. Now, for Gretchen Whitmer, I think, and we're also forgetting Alaska out here, that's going to be a likely red state. For Whitmer in her state, I think that Michigan, under a Whitmer versus J.D. Vance, is on that narrow edge of being a state that Democrats can really lock in on, but I don't know if I would consider it to be likely. I'd consider Minnesota likely, and I think Colorado would be safe, and New Mexico would be likely, and Virginia would be likely. New Hampshire would move back to being likely. Maine at large would be likely. Nebraska second would be. But for the case of Michigan, I'm not as thoroughly convinced. And I only say that because I think on a nationalized presidential race, things are very different. Michigan is a state that overwhelmingly voted for Whitmer, but to only stay in the boundaries of the state of Michigan. And arguably, 2018, she ran a very strong campaign, but ran in a year that was very conducive to a Democratic victory in Michigan. After all, neighboring Pennsylvania, Democrats won by a whopping 16 points. 6 years later, Republicans would go on to win the open Senate seat in that race, despite Democrats winning it in 2018 by 13 points. So the national environment was very different. But Whitmer was not on a national stage. Yeah, she did well in 2018, and in 2022, she benefited from the fact that she was a popular incumbent, knew how to run a campaign, but that Tudor Dixon was polling in 5th place before she won the Republican primary, not because she beat all the odds, but because the 5 leading contenders all cheated, or at least were accused of such and disqualified from the election. And so Tudor Dixon was brought up a very disillusioned GOP where there were 2 people competing and saying that they were respective, party chairs of the Michigan GOP. Either way, Michigan, not in a great condition in 22 for a Republican victory, and Republicans did not win it. Do I think that means Whitmer wins by 5 to 10 points in Michigan in 2028? I don't make that point. I think she wins the state. Don't get me wrong. I don't think you're getting it to a point where it's 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. For J.D. Vance, he has some states that are going to be more locked in as they were in 2024. Texas went to Trump by 14. Florida went to Trump by 13. One could reasonably contend that while Whitmer might be able to win again some of those more independent voters, these states are too far gone for them to be back in that column of voting in favor of the Democratic Party, or even getting close to voting in favor of the Democratic Party, bringing the total toss-up number here to about 94. Now, I've kind of already spoiled Michigan, saying that Michigan, I do believe, goes to the Democratic Party. I think you're going to see upwards of a 4 to 5 point margin. But looking at some of these states where J.D. Vance might have the upper hand, I don't know how convinced I am that Whitmer is going to be the person at baseline. Again, VP makes a difference. And again, we have not seen a presidential campaign from Whitmer yet. But I do think that of the demographics that she often did very well in, especially in 2022, I look at Michigan and I say, there are some regions here and some parts of the state that actually did find themselves not voting as much and in line with, Whitmer as you would have expected coming from the last presidential cycle. Joe Biden won by about 38 points in Wayne County, Michigan. Looking at the governor's level, Gretchen Whitmer expanded, but not by the same amount that you might expect. If Biden's winning this district by, let's say, about 38 points, and Whitmer's winning it around this point by about 43, the state didn't shift 5 points to the left. The state shifted by about nearly, 10 points to the left. This county didn't follow suit. And looking at some of the more nitty-gritty areas that Whitmer has seen, while she does have a lot of support, especially in the state of Michigan, extending that elsewhere, I don't know if we're going to find that to be the easiest set of circumstances. I do think she wins the election. I'm going to spoil that. I think she wins the election. I think she wins in Wisconsin, and I think she wins in Pennsylvania, which is enough to put her over the top. But to the degree that it extends to an expansive vote share amongst Latino voters, Black voters, Asian American voters, I can see it in Michigan, and I can see it in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. But these are states with higher than normal percentage of voters being white Americans, which Whitmer actually does very well on, especially suburban white voters. A big reason why she's able to usher in a map that looks more blue than Biden's presidential victory here just 2 years prior. And so thinking about the 2028 election, well, I don't think J.D. Vance is this, great whisperer on the Republican side that's going to trounce Whitmer amongst Latino voters or black voters. Absolutely not. That's not going to be the case. Whitmer is going to win every demographic group besides white voters. I don't think you're seeing it enough that it puts Whitmer in the favorite position in every single state. Now, I do think it extends so far that she wins in Georgia. I think this is a state that pretty much with any type of standard Democrat that can win over, key portions, especially the Atlanta metro area, college-educated voters, white suburban voters, black voters by higher margins than Kamala Harris did, and turnout by higher margins than what we saw for Democrats in 2024. That is the key to success in Georgia, and that is largely what kept Georgia so competitive in 2024 when almost every other battleground state shifted to the right. Georgia shifted to the left relative to 2016. Trump improved in Wisconsin, he improved in Michigan, he improved in Pennsylvania, he improved in Arizona, he improved in Nevada, but in Georgia, Donald Trump did not. Underperformed by about 3 points. I think it's reasonable to conclude that Whitmer would win the state. Now, I think Vance comes ahead in Maine's 2nd District. I don't think it's the same Trump effect. I think Democrats also narrowly lose North Carolina. It has been an age-old problem, and I don't think that 2028 will be the race to fix it unless you run someone like Cooper or throw him on the VP ticket, which is not even a guarantee and probably not even a reality given that he's running for Senate this cycle. The two states that really give me trouble are Nevada and Arizona. Nevada being the state that flipped for the first time in 2024, that hadn't voted for Republicans for president since 20 years prior. Literally, the 2004 election was the last time Republicans won Nevada, and I do think that where we are right now, J.D. Vance still wins the state. I think that it was an impressive margin for Trump. Vance and the Republicans narrowly hold on to it, and I believe the same about Arizona. Now, I do think that Whitmer has the opportunity and the ability to win over a lot of these lost voters by the Democratic electorate. After all, you don't win in a state like Michigan, especially as competitive of a state like Michigan, without broad coalitions, and a winning one, evidently, twice. But thinking about the 2028 election, again, Vance is not this guy who's going to be phenomenal for the GOP, but I don't think he'd be the worst candidate that Republicans could run. He's unpopular, and I think he'd lose. That's the baseline. Whitmer's popular. She knows how to win in a battleground state. She knows how to win in a state that Kamala Harris lost, and a lot of it is regional. Her appeal to Michigan is often a reason why she can appeal in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, but might not be as appealing to voters in Arizona or Nevada. Thus, why she does better in some areas than others. And while the final map here does show that I do think Whitmer wins the election, 286 to 252, looking at where you are in the 2028 election, a victory for Democrats is a victory. Vance is not this candidate that I think can be as boogeymaned as Trump. And that's why it's probably not easier to beat Trump, because I think Trump is actually a very formidable candidate, but uniquely difficult to beat Trump in a way that Vance might be more mainstream. And mainstream, in some cases, can bring back over some of those disaffected voters, especially voters that abandoned Republicans under the day and age of Trump coming down that escalator in 2016, went to Biden in 2020, maybe back to Trump in 24, but would be all in for Vance. I think some of that does counteract some of those gains you've seen. We've been working with a 10-year game plan here of looking at elections under the purview of an impending or president, Donald Trump. And what that has done is reshaped how we've understood many of these key demographics. There are Romney staffers that became Kamala Harris staffers in 2024. And with someone like J.D. Vance, while he's certainly unpopular and has an association with Trump, there are still conservatives out there that would not vote for Trump that would vote for Vance. And they exist. And while I don't think that it's enough to win back massive droves of numbers that you've already lost being unpopular, with voters turning on your administration, I do think that it means you're not headed towards a complete and total collapse in a way that maybe Republicans were in 2020, which is why Biden cleared 300 electoral votes in a way I don't think that many Democrats, or really any Democrat, could at this point in the next cycle. Certainly some could, but I don't know if it's the likeliest thing to happen. And Whitmer, in some, again, circumstances could too. Had North Carolina just gone 1 point to the left in this circumstance, she would clear 300 electoral votes. You'd see that. But I don't think that's where we are. I do think that J.D. Vance wins North Carolina, wins Arizona, and wins Nevada. But Gretchen Whitmer flips back the Rust Belt, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, wins Georgia, ultimately ushering her into the presidency with 286 electoral votes to J.D. Vance's 252. A lot can change between now and November of 2028. But this would be a Midwestern showdown worth the wait and worth the watch. because it would be a very, very hyper-competitive race. And while Whitmer, I do think, is a top recruit for Democrats, the 2028 election will not be a cakewalk. And until after we see the midterms, we will not know the true strength and true electoral power of both political parties under a second Trump administration until then. To which we say, it'll be fascinating to watch, and we will watch and keep our eyes peeled over the next year and a half as you get into the midterms and go straight into the 2028 primary season and eventually general election season, where maybe we'll end up with the Democratic nominee, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and Republican nominee, Vice President J.D. Vance. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2028 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.